Hello everyone, my name is Devansh and I'm a columnist at Swabhiman, and today we are interviewing Dr. Mytheli Sreenivas for our new issue, Family, a Social Structure. Dr. Sreenivas has very kindly agreed to help us understand Devdasis, the stigma surrounding them, and their lifestyle. Dr. Sreenivas has published a paper focusing on Devdasis and their lifestyle, whose link will be added to this video. So, Dr. Srinivas, I'll start with the first question. Can you give us some insight into the background, roles, and history of Devdasis in colonial times, especially with relation frameworks governing women's sexuality in those times?
Yeah, absolutely. So thanks so much, Devansh. I'm really glad to be here, and I'm really glad that you're having this conversation um, and taking up these questions around family and normativity and challenges to those norms. So I guess the first thing to say about Devdasis is it's a really broad category, right? It's not just that's broad in the sense that women from varying class and caste backgrounds with various access to material wealth and privileges and education were all part of this sort of category of Devadasis through the colonial period. So the first thing is to think about it doesn't just refer to sort of one kind of person or one set of social relationships. So then kind of what does connect Devdasis, right? If there's such a diversity in this category, really broadly, probably some aspect of, dedication or marriage, right? Or ritual marriage to a deity in a Hindu temple. But what that actually entailed and how it shaped people's lives really varied. But that's just sort of my background to saying, so this is that practice of sort of temple dedication is an old and long-standing one, especially in South India, in what's now Karnataka, Tamil Nadu, and Andhra, especially. So I think it's an old and long-standing institution that was connected to South Indian ideas about kingship, right? That there was a close relationship between the power of ruling elites and the power of Hindu temples. And these women who were dedicated as Devadasis tended to sort of be a link between those, right? Between the power of the king and the power of the temple. But in the colonial period, to get to your question specifically, right? In the colonial period, I think there's a big shift because the colonial law tended to criminalize these women as prostitutes. Was the terminology that was used in the law. We might say sex workers today. And so this process of criminalization went alongside with a process of sort of social marginalization as well. And so a concern or a claim about these women as being immoral, sex workers, and sort of devaluing the social relationships and methods of social reproduction that existed within these communities. So you see a long period, not just within the colonial law, but with Hindu social reformers as well, who sort of aimed to kind of reform these women into, I have quotes on that, into kind of a proper, again, quotes, form of monogamous marriage. And so that is the sort of the origins or sort of part of the specific stigma that attended to the Devadasis throughout the colonial period until the very end in 1947, when in Madras presidency, the Devadasi institution, the practice of dedication to temples was itself outlawed.
Okay, okay. Thank you for that. Now I'd move on to the second question. But before that, I would like to understand the situation that Devdasis are today, these days, like in present moment. Do you have any idea about that?
Well, I will say it's not the center of my own work. I am a historian, and I tend my work on Devadasis focuses mostly on the pre 1947 period.
Okay.
But I will say, from based on other scholars, I think Lucinda Ramberg has done some really fantastic work on Karnataka, for example, that kind of looks at ways in which some of these forms, at least for the women that she is studying in northern Karnataka, some of these social and ritual forms have continued, right, or
Okay.
continue to exist in terms of dedication to temples, in terms of specific ritual services, in terms of a unique and particular status. But at the same time, just as in the colonial period, right, the kind of marginalization and stigmatization of these women as sex workers and their real economic, material, and social vulnerabilities, right, is often lower caste or Dalit women who are sometimes reliant on forms of sex work and exploitative conditions also continues, right? So that stigmatization continues as well. But I'll say that comes from the research of other scholars and not so much the work that I've done.
Okay, okay. Thank you so much for that clarification. So moving on to the second question, can you give a historical timeline or maybe sort of a rough idea about the stigma that surrounded the Devdasis and how has it changed in the recent times, if at all? Moreover, has the perception of them changed or is it still the same?
You know, I think that's a really good question in terms of, you know, there's a kind of unevenness to the
Okay.
changes, right, that have occurred over time. So I think, you know, you can find particular watershed moments, right? If we want to think about how do we give a chronology, right? So among those, you know, in really broad terms, going back to what I was saying before, if we think
Yeah,
about Devdasis in the 17th and 18th century, for example, um, so, you know, prior to uh, colonial rule over most of southern India, then I think you find a moment where Devdasis occupied a particular kind of religious ritual space as well as a what we might call today a political space in mediating the relationship between um, uh, sorry, my phone went off on the side there. Let me just turn it off. Um,
it's okay.
Mediating the space between sort of the political power of the king and the ritual and material power of temples.
Okay.
But the advent of colonial rule meant a challenge to that form of politics, right? And that kind of political entity. So the kings of South India eventually became, you know, sort of zamindars and landlords for the most part. And so they continued some of their practices of connection to temples. They continued their patronage of those temples, including those Devdasi women. So it's not that colonialism began and then the whole institution fell apart. It didn't. But it did pose this real kind of threat to kingship. So you can see one kind of watershed moment, one change over time in that shift, right? From the the sort of kingly powers of the South Indian rulers to what you might call a colonial bureaucracy that didn't hold to any of those ideological or religious premises, right? And that based its politics on different grounds, that wasn't routed through the temple as a space of political and ritual activity. So if that's kind of one watershed, a second moment, but Devdasis continued, the institution continued through the whole of the 19th century. But then another kind of moment is this sort of moral movement that you might call, right? This sort of anti-Nach movement, right? That sort of stigmatized these women as prostitutes or sex workers. And there you see, at the same time, you see a decline of the kinds of patronage that had sustained these women. So even as those sort of ruling elites kind of lost some of their power, they also pulled back on some of the patronage activities. And so some of these women who had access to temple property, right, that they performed various ritual or religious activities in exchange for you know, some kind of material benefit. They lost,
Okay.
some women lost access to those. Those were land forms of land ownership known as inams, right? So as they lost access to those forms of property, Devadasis through the colonial period became sort of more materially vulnerable, you know, sort of less able to sustain themselves and their practices, their families and social relationships, because they were losing those sources of wealth on the one hand, and on the other hand, they were being sort of stigmatized, right, as sex workers. In 1929, There's another watershed moment, and that is a piece of legislation that was passed in Madras specifically, that broke once and for all the connection between these forms of property that Devdasis had, that some Devdasis had, these inams, and the temple service they were doing. This may have been, it's a complicated story. For some Devdasi women, that might have been a positive and empowering move, actually. But nevertheless, it did kind of break that relationship once and for all. So that's another watershed moment. And then finally, in 1947, the institution itself was outlawed.
Okay.
Dedicating women to temples, that practice was outlawed itself. Since then, in post-colonial India, there have been other laws passed at the state level. Karnataka passed a bunch of laws in the 1980s, again, kind of limiting or ending some of these ritual practices around Devdasis. So the trend that you see through the colonial period really continues after 1947 too, where all aspects of Devdasi's lives become stigmatized, right? Their material relationships, to the temple, their intimate or sexual relationships, with various patrons, that they had long-term or short-term relationships with, that becomes stigmatized as well. And they lose many of the sources of their material income. So all of that kind of comes together to render them increasingly kind of marginalized and vulnerable through the 20th century.
Okay, thank you so much for that. Moving on to the third question. So this would be more specific because for the heading of our issue. Uh, so who did the Devdasi's family consist of? Because like they were a group of women who practiced the same profession, lived around the temple, and more focus on did they have children and those aspects of it. And how did this specifically affect the idea of a heteronormative idea of family, which was there prevalent within southern India at that point of time? Yeah.
Yeah, that's a great question. So, you know, I started off by saying that Devdasi is a very capacious category. It's really wide ranging. So I want to qualify what I'm saying, to add that therefore, individual Devdasi's social relationships or family relationships really varied. So it's hard to kind of just generalize into one form.
Okay. Yeah.
However, that said, I think so. I guess a couple of things. One is there's a tendency sometimes to romanticize Devdasis, right? To say, oh, there are these women who existed outside heteronormative marriage, and sort of, isn't that cool, right? Isn't that different? And is it something we can look to? So there's that sort of one side. Then there's another tendency to sort of see them as the exemplary victims, right, of exploitation because of the sex work, because of the real material hardships that many such women have faced. So I want to try to think of an understanding of Devdasi families and social relationships that doesn't do either of those things, right? That doesn't kind of glorify them as outside patriarchy, because they're not, but also doesn't only see them as victims, right? And so that's kind of my starting point to understand Devadasi's social reproduction, essentially. So I think there, if we think about, for example, the relationship with temples, Devadasi women were expected to do certain kinds of work in temples in exchange for certain material supports and benefits. Therefore, unlike, for the colonial period at least, unlike for the majority of Hindu women, Devdasis had access to property in their own right if they had one of these inams or connections to temples. Not all women had this. For those who did, right, this was something unique. It was very different than colonial law on ordinary Hindu wives who didn't have
Yeah.
access to property, right? So that's a sort of interesting moment that centers the figure of the woman in the family, right, as the one who has access to property, as the one who can pass that along to descendants. And so I think that's the place that kind of really challenges heteronormative family structure potentially, right? By centering women in a different way. So there is that possibility. And Devdasi women, some women, not all by any means, but some women through the 19th and early 20th century were fairly wealthy through those connections with temples and inams. Some of them did pass along property, and they would pass it along to their daughters, whether their own biological daughters or daughters through adoption. Which was another method of sort of sustaining the family. And this property went to women because it was women who could perform those Devdasi functions. So again, you can see a vision of family structure that goes along with property relationships, right? That is very different than the sort of mode of patrilineal, patrilocal descent of a sort of quote unquote ordinary Hindu family. That said, not all women who were within these Devdasi communities were themselves Devdasis. And of course, Devdasis also had men in their families, including sons, not surprisingly, right? And so I think some of those men were involved in the same ritual practices, in the dance and music performances and arts that Devdasis were sort of the core keepers of those traditions. So there were certainly men involved in those social relationships, but the sort of centrality of women, I think, was relatively unique. On the other hand, one of the ways in which I talked about this sort of quote unquote moral reform movement. One of the energies of that moral reform movement became around trying to reform Devdasis into a more heteronormative patrilineal family structure, that was more like ordinary Hindu families. And so you can sort of track that through the 20th century was this move by various community organizations within Devdasi communities to sort of move them into that more patrilineal structure and away from the relatively unique forms of property ownership, social reproduction, inheritance, and kinship that actually characterized some of those women.
Okay. Yeah, my next question was regarding that about the children and how did they inherit wealth? Do you think did the Devdasis give gave their wealth that they possess to their sons too? Is there any research on that?
I don't know. I think I have not seen a lot of work on that. I guess we can say there's sort of maybe there's two ways to think about this, right? One is the structure of law and property ownership that they operated under. The second is the choices that individual Devdasis may have made. So on that latter one, I don't know. I would imagine, right, that like in all families, there are methods of sharing and community
Very unique.
that may or may not be supported by the law per se.
Yeah.
But I do think that on the former, in terms of the structure, right, if you are a Devdasi and you have this particular kind of legal connection to a temple, the way that you would have to pass that along would be to somebody who could perform those services, right? So it does tend to sort of center women. But at the same time, I think there was I guess a fair amount. Devdasis still lived within a patriarchal society that in the bigger picture privileged, male ownership of property. So I can't imagine that they would have been unaffected by that, right? They were also still part of that patriarchal society. So again, to sort of step back from the kind of glorification model, right, which I'm very wary of because these were also women who were exploited for their labor. So I think what does it mean to live at odds with heteronormative modes of family life in a deeply heteropatriarchal society? That's always a challenge, right? And I think that's where many Devdasis sort of found themselves.
Yeah, okay. So you were talking about this major reform movement by the Britishers as well as within the Hindu community itself. So could you give us a little bit of an idea how did that exactly affect the post-independence laws? Since, and don't expect a lot here because you said your research was a little more specific towards 1947. But even then, you can give a little more idea about how that affected the colonial laws exactly. Because so I remember reading this paper by Janki Nair where she talked about Devdasis and their life. So there was very specific methods that they were banned, they weren't allowed to do those things, and a lot of their inams were basically cancelled. So can you give a
Hmm.
little more specific answer on that? I know you have talked about it, but I had written the question, so I thought might as well just ask.
Yeah, sure, sure.
Yeah.
So, yeah, so, this varied in, since you mentioned Janaki Nar, I mean, this varied some, between the laws of Madras Presidency and the laws, in Mysore and other princely states. Um, but the general, so the exact timing varied, but the general trends were the same, which is one, I would say by 1947, the legal like laws had already dismantled Devdasi institutions for the most part.
Okay.
So it's not, I mean, and post-colonial laws continue those trends. So in that sense, I would say we really need to look to the colonial legal structures to kind of understand what's going on. And so, yes, so to go back, 1929 was a kind of severing of the relationship between Devdasis and Inams, mainly by saying that Devdasis no longer needed to do the temple service in order to receive income from Inams. This was
Oh,
a process called Inam enfranchisement, which meant that those lands that were so basically Inams were lands that were set aside, and the income from that would go to support temples in some way. Some of those Inam lands were um, given over, right, for the Devdasi service. So after 1929, in Madras Presidency, that relationship was severed. It didn't mean that the Devdasis immediately lost access to the income from Inam land. It meant that they didn't have to do those services anymore. So that's one moment, right, which pushes back against the idea, the very idea of Devdasi economic and social relationships, right? It pushes against the idea that they actually have a role vis-a-vis the temple. And it pushes back or ends the notion that it's a propertied relationship. So by the
okay.
time in 1947, the law that's passed is banning the dedication of women in temples. And so by the time that law is passed, the material basis for Devdasi dedication was already over. So that's one piece. The other piece, since you asked about children and families, is that throughout the period of colonial rule and into the post-colonial period, the process of Devdasi social reproduction was gradually criminalized. So I talked about adoption of girls, right? As a way to kind of continue Devdasi lineages. Sometimes the colonial law recognized those adoptions, but many times it did not, and seeing them as instead a criminal traffic in prostitution. So there was a contradiction between the civil law under colonial rule, which sometimes recognized Devadasi custom as something unique, and the criminal law of trafficking, prostitution, trafficking in minors, all that kind of stuff, which criminalized those adoption practices. So that's another direction we can look at to see how Devadasi social reproduction became rendered impossible or marginalized within the law, by saying that this was not a legitimate adoption. This was simply women trafficking in girls. So
Okay.
that's another place that and those laws, to my knowledge and understanding, sort of continue into the post-colonial period too, right? So that
Yeah.
those adoptions tend to be criminalized and not recognized in law.
Okay, okay. Thank you so much for this, Dr. Sreenivas. I'm really grateful that you agreed to do this, and I hope this was a comfortable experience for you too. Would you like to add anything?
No, I think this was great. Thank you so much. I'm really glad to have a chance to talk about these issues.